Cordelia Ashworth's hands began to shake at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. It wasn't a big tremor. It wasn't the kind of shaking that makes people turn and stare. It was something smaller, more intimate, the kind of tremor you only notice if you're paying attention, if you're watching, if you've learned to read fear in the details, those that others ignore. The sound of her fork tapping against the ceramic plate was almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic clinking, like the heartbeat of a bird trapped in a cage, too small for its wings. She tried to grip the utensil tighter, but that only made the trembling worse. She reached for a sugar packet with her right hand. Her fingers, thin as willow branches, brushed against the paper, and then her sleeve slid back, just an inch, maybe two, enough. The bruises were shaped like fingers, 4 parallel marks on the inside of her forearm, with a 5th darker circle where a thumb would have pressed. The kind of mark left by someone who grabs with force, with intention, with a message. From the corner booth, a man in a dark suit watched. He said nothing. He didn't react. His expression remained exactly as it had been before, neutral, calculated, impenetrable. Only his eyes moved, tracking the path of that sleeve as it slid back down to cover what wasn't meant to be seen. The coffee in front of him was growing cold. He didn't touch it. What kind of fear makes a woman shake even when she's finally in public? Marigold's Diner had occupied that corner of Whitmore Street for 51 years. It was the kind of place tourists never found, and locals protected with the silence of people who know that some good things only survive if they stay hidden. The tables had checkered tablecloths, red and white, worn soft at the edges by decades of elbows and long conversations. The smell of fresh brewed coffee mixed with toasted bread and something sweet that was always baking in the back kitchen. It was a safe place, ordinary, the kind of spot where people came to feel normal for a while. Dashiell. Whitmore Crane had been coming here every Tuesday for 3 years. Always the same corner booth, always with his back to the wall, always with a clear view of the door and the window, survival habits that become instinct when you've grown up in the world he grew up in. At 34, Dashiell had built an empire that most people only knew through rumors and vague headlines. In newspapers, nobody read all the way through. Successful entrepreneur, some said. Heir to questionable fortunes, others whispered. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between both versions. His power didn't come from violence, though violence was a tool he knew how to use when no other option remained. His power came from control, from information, from knowing things about people that they'd rather no one knew, from understanding that in this world, patience is more dangerous than any weapon. And Dashiell Whitmore Crane was an extraordinarily patient man. The elderly woman had walked in 20 minutes earlier. Dashiell had noticed her immediately, not because there was anything striking about her, but precisely because of the opposite, because of how small she was trying to make herself, because of the way she apologized 3 times to the waitress, just for existing, for taking up space, for daring to ask for a table for one. "I'm so sorry to trouble you. If it's too much bother, I can leave. I don't want to be an inconvenience." The waitress, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, had smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Ma'am, you have every right in the world to be here. Would you like a menu, or do you already know what you'd like?" The elderly woman had hesitated. Dashiell watched her eyes scan the laminated menu like she was solving a complex math problem. He watched her lips move silently, calculating. He watched the exact moment she decided to order the cheapest thing available. "Just coffee, please, with a little milk if it's not too much trouble." Her clothes were clean but old. A navy blue dress that had probably been elegant 15 years ago, now faded at the shoulders from too many washes. A beige cardigan buttoned up to the neck. Despite the warmth. Black, closed-toe shoes, the kind a woman of her generation would call dress shoes, but which now only served to hide. To hide what, exactly, Dashiell didn't know yet. But he was going to find out. Because there was something in the way that woman moved that felt painfully familiar. The way her shoulders curved inward, as if trying to occupy less space than her body physically needed. The way her eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds, not with hope, but with dread. The habit of smiling even when no one was watching, as if she were practicing. Dashiell had seen that same posture before, many years ago. In another woman, in another life, in his mother. The memory arrived uninvited, as it always did. His mother in the kitchen of that tiny apartment, split lip and a fake smile, telling him she'd bumped into the cupboard door. His mother counting coins from the glass jar to buy bread while his father spent the paycheck on gambling and liquor. His mother waking him in the middle of the night to flee to his grandmother's house because Daddy had a bad day at work. Dashiell was 8 years old when he learned to recognize fear disguised as normalcy. And now, 26 years later, that same fear was sitting 3 tables away, trembling over a cup of coffee with milk. The woman's name was Cordelia. Cordelia Ashworth, née Pemberton, though it had been 13 years since the Pemberton part had anyone left to accompany. Her husband, Theodore, had died of a sudden heart attack while watering the plants on the balcony. A Tuesday morning, the sun shining, birds singing, and then silence. Cordelia was 78 years old. She had been a librarian for 44 of those years at the same branch, in the same neighborhood where she was born, raised, married, and widowed. She had been respected, loved, needed. Now she was invisible. The invisibility had arrived gradually, like the tide rising without you noticing until the water reaches your neck. First, it was invitations that stopped coming, then phone calls that grew shorter, more spread out, more full of excuses, then neighbors who waved without stopping, former library patrons who crossed the street to avoid conversation. The world kept spinning while she grew more and more still. Theodore had been her anchor. Without him, Cordelia discovered she had spent decades without learning how to float alone. Her only son, Bennett, lived in Seattle. He called once a month, always rushed, always with promises to visit that never materialized. "Work, Mom. You know how it is." Cordelia knew. She also knew that work was a convenient excuse not to deal with a mother who was aging alone on the other side of the country. The proposal had come 19 months ago. Bennett had hired a caregiver. "So you won't be alone, Mom, so you'll have company, someone to help around the house." Cordelia had protested at first. She didn't need help. She could take care of herself. She had raised a son, managed a library full of books and demanding patrons, survived 42 years of marriage with its highs and lows. Who was her son to decide she was no longer capable? But Bennett had insisted. And in the end, Cordelia had given in. Because she was tired of fighting battles, she no longer had the strength to win. Renata Voss arrived with a professional smile and an impeccable resume. 52 years old, excellent references, experience with elderly patients. Cordelia had felt relief at first. Renata was efficient, organized. She took care of everything. The problem was that everything included things Cordelia had never asked her to handle. Now in the diner, Cordelia held her coffee cup with both hands, trying to control the trembling. It wasn't a tremor of old age. It wasn't Parkinson's or any other disease with a medical name. It was the trembling of someone who has learned to live in constant fear. Renata didn't know she was here. Renata thought Cordelia was napping in her room with the door full closed, as it was supposed to be, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. "Rest time," Renata called it, "so you can regain your strength." But Cordelia had stopped resting months ago. Instead, she had learned to wait, to listen, to recognize the sound of Renata's footsteps, moving away toward the kitchen, to open the bathroom window carefully so it wouldn't make noise, to slip through the back alley like a fugitive in her own home. Today, she had managed to escape for 30 minutes, 30 minutes of freedom that felt like breathing after being underwater too long. The coffee tasted like glory, not because it was particularly good, but because no one had told her she couldn't have it. Because no one was counting the calories she consumed. Because no one was going to ask her afterward if she really needed that sugar, if she really needed that milk, if she really thought at her age she could afford such excesses. Dashiell observed all of this from his corner booth. It wasn't hard to read the story if you knew where to look. The way the old woman's eyes lit up at the first sip of coffee, the small eye of satisfaction that escaped her lips, the way she looked at the restaurant door, not with fear that someone bad would walk in, but with fear that someone familiar would. And then there were the bruises. Dashiell had seen enough marks of violence in his life to recognize the different stories they told. There were marks from fights, from accidents, from genuine clumsiness. And there were marks of control. Marks that said, don't move. Marks that said, do what I say. Marks that said, no one will believe you if you talk. The marks on Cordelia's arm were the third kind. He rose from his booth with the fluidity of someone who has learned to move without attracting attention. He left a bill on the table, more than the coffee cost, as always, and walked toward the exit. But instead of leaving, he stopped beside Cordelia's table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice modulated to the situation. Now it was soft, respectful, almost shy. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Cordelia looked up. Her eyes, a brown faded by the years, instantly filled with alertness. Dashiell recognized the expression. It was the look of someone accustomed to questions bringing trouble. "Yes?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a habit probably. She had learned not to speak loudly. "Are you Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth? From the Whitmore Street Library?" The change in her expression was imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. A flash of something. Pride. Nostalgia. Surprise that someone remembered her, crossed her face before the mask of caution covered it again. "I was a librarian, yes, many years ago. Do we know each other?" Dashiell didn't know her, but he was going to. "Not directly," he said, sitting in the chair across from her without asking permission. It was a calculated move. Asking permission would have given her the option to say no, and Dashiell needed this conversation to happen. "But I believe you knew my mother, a long time ago, Seraphina Whitmore Crane." The name was a gamble, a lie built on a truth. His mother had been named Seraphina, yes, but he didn't remember if she'd ever mentioned a librarian named Cordelia. However, Cordelia was a 78-year-old woman who had been a librarian for 4 decades. The odds that she had known someone named Seraphina were high. The odds that Seraphina had a son were even higher. Seraphina. Cordelia frowned, searching through decades of memories. Seraphina Whitmore Crane. Whitmore Crane. Dashiell waited. He didn't push. He let the silence do the work. "Was your mother a thin woman, with very dark hair? Used to come in every Thursday afternoon?" Dante's heart skipped. His mother had been thin. Her hair had been black as midnight until the gray started to conquer it. And she had taken him to the library. Every week. It had been their escape. "Yes," he said. And this time it wasn't a lie. Cordelia smiled. It was a small smile, fragile, like something she hadn't used in a long time and wasn't sure still worked. "I remember Seraphina. She came to the library once and stayed until closing. You must have been 7, 8? You weren't just there for books. She needed somewhere safe to be, somewhere to think." Dashiell felt something crack behind his ribs, a memory he had buried. "She came to you once after closing, didn't she?" he asked. Cordelia's eyes grew distant. "She knocked on the back door. It was raining. Her face was—" She paused. "She asked me if I knew anywhere she could go, if I knew anyone who could help. I gave her some phone numbers, a women's shelter, a lawyer who worked pro bono." She looked at Dante. "I never knew if she used them." "She used them," Dashiell said. "She used them and we got out. And my mother never forgot that you were the first person who didn't tell her to be patient, that marriages have their ups and downs, that she probably had some fault in it too." Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. They didn't fall. She had learned long ago not to let them, but they were there, gleaming on the edge of her lashes. "I'm glad to hear you're well. That Seraphina is well. How is she?" "She passed away 5 years ago," Dashiell said. And this truth hurt more than any lie. "But she lived. That's what matters. Because of you, she lived." Cordelia nodded slowly, the nod of someone who understands that life and death aren't always opposites, that sometimes surviving is already a form of victory. Dashiell glanced at his watch. They had been talking for 10 minutes, 10 minutes that Cordelia probably didn't have. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, lowering his voice even though no one was nearby, "do you need help?" The question fell between them like a stone in still water. The ripples spread in silence. Cordelia opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes went to the door, the window, the outside world that suddenly seemed too big and too small at the same time. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice broke on the last word. Dashiell didn't push. Instead, he pulled a card from his pocket. It was white, with no name, just a phone number printed in the center. "In case someday you do know what I'm talking about," he said, sliding the card across the table. "This number works any hour, any day. It doesn't matter how late it is or how small the problem might seem." Cordelia looked at the card like it was a snake that might bite her. I can't accept this," she whispered. "If someone sees it, if she finds it, then hide it where no one would look. Inside an old book, under the insole of a shoe, wherever. Dashiell stood. But keep it, please." Cordelia's fingers, still trembling, brushed the edge of the card. She didn't take it, but she didn't push it away either. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to an old woman you barely remember?" Dashiell looked at her for a long moment. In another life, in another context, he would have lied. He would have invented a noble reason, a convenient excuse. But there was something about this trembling woman that made it impossible to lie. "Because I recognize fear," he said, "and because someone should have done this for my mother long before you did. Consider it returning a favor." He walked away before she could respond, before she could refuse the help she didn't yet know she needed. At the table, Cordelia sat staring at the white card. Her hands had stopped shaking. She tucked it inside her left shoe, under the insole where no one would look. Cordelia Ashworth had been happy once. Not happy in the way they show it in movies, with violin music and perfect endings, but happy in the real way. The happiness of Sunday mornings with coffee and cinnamon rolls. The happiness of cataloging books while Theodore read the newspaper aloud, commenting on world events as if they were neighborhood gossip. The happiness of comfortable silences. Of knowing exactly how someone takes their tea, of waking up every day next to the same person and feeling like it was exactly where you were supposed to be. Theodore Ashworth had been a quiet man. An accountant by profession, a gardener by passion. He spent weekends pruning roses and talking to plants as if they could understand him. "Plants are the best listeners," he used to say. "They never interrupt, and they always grow toward the light." When he died, Cordelia discovered that she had become one of those plants. Rooted in place. Unable to move, waiting for someone to tell her where the light was. The first months were a blur of casseroles brought by neighbors and sympathy cards that piled up on the table unanswered. Cordelia functioned on autopilot. She got up, she ate, she slept. She breathed in and breathed out and wondered why that simple act felt so impossibly heavy. Grief, she learned, wasn't one feeling. It was 1,000. It was the anger that came when she opened the medicine cabinet and saw his razor still sitting there. It was the guilt of laughing at something on television and then remembering there was no one to share the joke with. It was the crushing weight of a house that was suddenly too big, too quiet, too full of memories that echoed off walls that didn't know they'd lost their purpose. She stopped going out. At first, it was because she didn't feel like it. Then it was because she'd forgotten how. The grocery store felt too loud, the pharmacy too bright, the park where she and Theodore used to walk their dog, long dead now, buried under the oak tree in the backyard, felt like a museum of ghosts. Bennett called once a month. "How are you, Mom?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You need to get out more." "I know, sweetheart. I'll try to visit soon." "I know, sweetheart." Cordelia had stopped believing that last promise somewhere around month 6. Then Renata arrived. Bennett had hired her through an agency. "Highly recommended," he said. "Specializes in seniors living alone. She'll help with the cooking and cleaning, make sure you're taking your medications on time, give you some company." Renata Voss was the kind of woman who commanded attention without asking for it. Tall, sharp-featured, with hair dyed a shade of auburn that didn't quite match her skin tone, she wore sensible shoes and spoke in a voice that was simultaneously soothing and firm. The kind of voice that made you feel like everything was going to be handled, whether you wanted it handled or not. "You poor thing," Renata had said on that first day, surveying the house with eyes that catalogued every dusty corner and unwashed dish. Living here all alone. Your son tells me you've been having trouble keeping up with things. Don't you worry. I'm here now. Cordelia hadn't told Bennett she was having trouble. She had told him she missed Theodore. She had told him she sometimes forgot to eat. She had told him the house felt empty. Bennett had heard. Mom is declining. Mom needs watching. Mom is becoming a problem that needs to be solved. At first, Renata's presence was a relief. The house was clean. Meals appeared at regular intervals. Someone noticed when Cordelia hadn't brushed her hair or changed her clothes. For the first time since Theodore died, there was structure. Order, a reason to keep going. The changes came slowly. So slowly that Cordelia didn't notice them happening until they had already happened. First, it was the phone. Mrs. Ashworth, you left the phone off the hook again. I found it in the bathroom. You must have forgotten. Cordelia hadn't remembered bringing the phone to the bathroom. But she also hadn't remembered not bringing it. Memory at 78 was a slippery thing. Maybe she had forgotten. Maybe she was starting to slip. Why don't I keep track of the phone from now on? Renata suggested. Just so we don't have any more mix-ups. I'll bring it to you when someone calls. It seemed reasonable. Helpful, even. Then the calls started coming less frequently. They must not have tried very hard to reach you, Renata would say. You know how people are. Everyone's so busy these days. Cordelia didn't know that. Renata had started screening calls. That her old friend Mabel from the library had called 3 times that month and been told that Mrs. Ashworth is resting and can't be disturbed. That her neighbor Eunice had stopped by twice and been turned away at the door. She's not doing well, Renata had told Eunice in a hushed, concerned voice. The doctor says too much stimulation is bad for her. She gets confused easily now. It's really better if she has peace and quiet. Eunice had nodded sympathetically and stopped coming by. Then, it was the money. Mrs. Ashworth, I hate to bring this up, but I found your checkbook in the strangest place. It was under the couch cushion. You must have put it there and forgotten. Again, Cordelia couldn't remember putting it there. Again, she felt that slippage, that doubt. Was her mind going? Was she becoming the confused old woman Renata seemed to see? Why don't I help you manage the bills? Renata offered. Just until we get things sorted out. I can make sure nothing important gets missed. Cordelia signed a power of attorney 3 months in. Bennett had encouraged it. It's just for practical purposes, Mom. So, Renata can handle things if you're not feeling up to it. She didn't know that Renata had already started making small withdrawals. $50 here, $100 there, always with reasonable explanations that Cordelia didn't think to question, because questioning would mean admitting she didn't trust the person who cooked her meals and washed her clothes and made sure she took her pills on time. The pills. Cordelia had taken the same medications for years, a blood pressure pill in the morning, a cholesterol pill at night, a mild sleep aid when the insomnia got bad. One day she noticed the pills looked different. The blood pressure medication, which had always been small and white, was now large and blue. The pharmacy changed suppliers, Renata said breezily. It's the same medicine, just a different manufacturer. Nothing to worry about. Cordelia worried anyway. The new pills made her feel foggy, heavy, like her thoughts were trying to swim through honey. She mentioned it to Renata, who clucked sympathetically and said it was probably just the weather, or her age, or maybe she wasn't sleeping well enough. She didn't know that Renata had substituted her regular medication with something stronger, something that kept her docile, confused, easy to manage. Then came the rules. Rest time is from 2 to 4, Mrs. Ashworth. Doctor's orders. The doctor had never said any such thing. You shouldn't go outside alone. What if you fall? What if you get lost? Your son would never forgive me. The bedroom door needs to stay closed at night for safety. In case of an emergency, I need to know where to find you. The bedroom door locked from the outside now. Renata had installed the lock for emergencies. Cordelia had watched her do it and felt something cold settle in her chest. But when she tried to protest, the words came out jumbled and confused, and Renata had looked at her with that particular expression, patient, concerned, slightly pitying, that made Cordelia wonder if maybe she was imagining things. It's for your own good, Renata had said. Everything I do is for your own good. The threats were never explicit. They didn't need to be. If you keep getting confused like this, Mrs. Ashworth, your son might have to consider other arrangements. A nursing home maybe, somewhere with round-the-clock care. I'm sure he'd want what's best for you. It would be such a shame if you had a fall. At your age, a broken hip is practically a death sentence. I read somewhere that most elderly people who break a hip never fully recover. You know no one would believe you if you complained about me. Old people get confused. They make things up. It's very common, very sad, but that's just how it is. That last one was said casually, almost offhandedly, while Renata was folding laundry. She didn't even look up. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Cordelia learned to whisper instead of speak. She learned to lower her eyes when Renata was in a bad mood. She learned the rhythms of her captor's days, when it was safe to move, when it was better to stay still, when silence was the only shield she had. She still wore her wedding ring. Theodore's had been buried with him, but hers remained on her finger, a thin gold band worn smooth by 53 years of marriage. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the medication fog had lifted just enough for clear thought, Cordelia would turn the ring and remember who she used to be: a librarian, a wife, a mother, a person who had helped other people find the books that would change their lives, who had given a scared young woman the phone numbers that would save her and her son. She had been someone once. Before the loneliness, before Renata, before fear became the air she breathed. Now, she was no one, just a trembling old woman in a diner, stealing 30 minutes of freedom while her jailer believed she was asleep. Cordelia's 30 minutes were almost up. She glanced at the clock above the diner counter. 3:14 p.m. If she left now, if she hurried, she could slip back through the bathroom window before Renata came to check on her at 3:30. Before the nap was supposed to end, before anyone knew she had ever been gone. But her legs didn't want to move. The coffee was almost gone, just a thin film of brown at the bottom of the cup, and the card from the strange young man was pressing against the arch of her foot, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Who was he really? Serafina's son, he'd said. The woman with the dark hair who had come to the library all those years ago. Desperate and bruised and looking for a way out. Cordelia remembered her, not perfectly. 4 decades of faces and names had blurred together, but she remembered the essence of her, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd flinched when another patron dropped a book. The son, barely school age, sitting at the children's table pretending to read while his whole body stayed alert to his mother's every movement. That boy was now a man in a tailored suit who looked at her like he could see straight through to her bones. And he had given her a phone number, a lifeline, a way out, that she didn't quite believe in, but couldn't quite let go of either. 3:16 p.m. She needed to go. She needed to go now. Cordelia reached for her purse, the small one Renata allowed her to keep, with nothing in it but a few crumpled tissues and a lip balm that had dried out months ago. And that was when the door to the diner opened. The world went silent. Or maybe it was just Cordelia's heart stopping. Renata Voss stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. Her eyes swept the diner, once, twice, and then landed on Cordelia like a hawk, spotting a mouse that had strayed too far from its hole. "Mrs. Ashworth." The voice was pleasant, concerned, the voice of a caring caregiver who had found her confused charge wandering where she shouldn't be. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You gave me quite a scare." Renata crossed the diner in quick, efficient strides. The other patrons barely looked up. Why would they? Just a middle-aged woman collecting an elderly relative. Nothing to see here, nothing that required attention or intervention or concern. "You know you're not supposed to go out alone," Renata continued, sliding into the seat across from Cordelia. Her voice was pitched perfectly, loud enough to be overheard, soft enough to seem intimate. What if something had happened? What if you'd gotten lost? You know how confused you get sometimes. Cordelia felt herself shrinking. It was automatic now. Her shoulders curved in. Her eyes dropped. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I just wanted some coffee. I can make you coffee at home, Mrs. Ashworth. Much better coffee than this." Renata's hand closed around Cordelia's wrist. Not hard enough to leave a mark, just hard enough to communicate. Come on, let's get you back before you have one of your spells. From somewhere in the diner, Cordelia wasn't sure where, she heard a chair scrape against the floor. Everything all right over here? The young man was back. Serafina's son. He stood a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, posture relaxed, but somehow conveying the sense that he could become very unrelaxed very quickly if the situation called for it. Renata's grip tightened fractionally. Her smile widened. Everything's fine. Just collecting my patient. She sometimes wanders off when she's having a bad day. Don't you, Mrs. Ashworth? Cordelia opened her mouth. For one wild, terrifying moment, she thought about telling the truth, about saying help me, or she's hurting me, or please don't let her take me back. But the words wouldn't come. They had been trained out of her, those words. Beaten, down by months of subtle threats and casual cruelties, and the constant, grinding fear of being seen as exactly what Renata said she was, a confused old woman who made things up. Yes, she whispered. I sometimes wander off. The young man's eyes met hers. Something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a silent conversation that happened in the space of a heartbeat. I see you, his eyes said. I know what's happening here. I'm not going to forget. Well, he said aloud, stepping back. I hope you feel better soon, Mrs. Ashworth. It was nice talking to you. Renata's eyes narrowed slightly. You know Mrs. Ashworth? Old family connection. My mother used to go to her library. He smiled, and there was nothing friendly in it. Small world, isn't it? He turned and walked out of the diner without looking back. Renata watched him go, and for the first time since Cordelia had known her, something flickered across her face that might have been uncertainty. It vanished almost, immediately, replaced by the familiar mask of professional concern. Come on, she said, pulling Cordelia to her feet. Let's get you home. We have a lot to talk about. The walk back was silent. Renata's hand stayed clamped around Cordelia's elbow, guiding her through the back alley, through the bathroom window, into the bedroom that had become her prison. Who was that man? Renata asked once the door was closed. The pleasant voice was gone now. The truth, Mrs. Ashworth. I always know when you're lying. I don't know. It wasn't entirely a lie. Cordelia didn't know who he really was. Just who he said he was. He recognized me from the library. That's all. Renata studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Of course, she said. That's all. The confused old librarian, recognized by a stranger. What a coincidence. She turned toward the door, then paused. If I find out you're lying to me, Mrs. Ashworth, if I find out you've told anyone anything. She let the sentence hang. Well, you know what happens to confused old women who make up stories about their caregivers. No one believes them, and they end up somewhere much, much worse than here. The door closed. The lock clicked. Cordelia sat on the edge of her bed, shaking harder than she had at the diner. The card was still in her shoe. Renata hadn't found it, hadn't even thought to check. For the first time in months, something that felt dangerously like hope flickered in her chest. She had a phone number. She had been seen. Someone out there knew. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Dashiell didn't go home after leaving the diner. Instead, he drove to the cemetery on the east side of town, the old one with the wrought iron gates and the oak trees that had been there longer than the city itself. His mother's grave was in the back corner, marked by a simple granite headstone that read only her name and dates. No epitaph. She had said she didn't want one. Just let me rest, she'd told him, in those final months. That's all I want now. Rest. Dashiell sat on the bench across from her grave for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen as the afternoon faded into evening. I found her, he said finally. The librarian. The one who helped you. The wind rustled through the oak leaves. It almost sounded like an answer. She's in trouble, Mom. The same kind of trouble you were in, and I'm going to help her, the way you would have wanted me to. He stayed until the sun went down. Then he made a phone call. Marcello, I need everything you can find on someone. Name's Renata Voss, works as a caregiver. Current employer is a woman named Cordelia Ashworth on Whitmore Street. He paused. And Marcello, I want the real information, not the public record stuff, the things she's trying to hide. The report came 2 days later. 23 pages of documentation that painted a picture so ugly, Dashiell had to set it down twice and walk away before he could finish reading. Renata Voss was 54 years old. She had worked as a caregiver for the past 15 years. She had excellent references and a clean background check. The excellent references were from dead people. 6 previous employers, all elderly, all living alone or with minimal family involvement, all dead within 2 years of hiring Renata Voss. Natural causes, the death certificate said. Heart failure, stroke, pneumonia. The kinds of things that killed old people every day. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would trigger an investigation. But Marcello had dug deeper. Bank records that showed suspicious transfers, wills that had been changed shortly before death, property titles quietly transferred, a pattern so subtle that no one would see it unless they were looking. Renata Voss wasn't just a bad caregiver, she was a predator, a methodical, patient predator who targeted vulnerable elderly people, isolated them from anyone who might notice something wrong, drained their resources, and then, what? Hastened their deaths? Let them die through neglect? The evidence wasn't clear on that point, but Dashiell could read between the lines. Cordelia Ashworth was her 7th target, and based on the financial records Marcello had obtained, Renata had already started the process. Small withdrawals from Cordelia's accounts, a recent change to Cordelia's will, bis room according to the notary's records, when Cordelia was not feeling well, and Renata had to help guide her hand. A life insurance policy with Renata listed as secondary beneficiary in recognition of her devoted service. Dashiell set down the report and stared at the wall of his study for a very long time. In his world, there were different kinds of justice. There was the quick kind, the kind that ended with bodies in alleys and problems that disappeared overnight. There was the legal kind, slow, uncertain, dependent on systems that often failed the people they were supposed to protect. And there was the third kind, the kind Dashiell preferred, the kind that took patience and planning and absolute precision, the kind where the truth became a weapon that couldn't be deflected or denied. He reached for the phone again. Marcello, I need a few more things. Court records for Renata Voss, any civil suits, complaints, anything that got buried. Medical records for her previous employers in the 6 months before they died. And I need to know who at Adult Protective Services handles the Whitmore Street district. Someone with a reputation for actually following up. He paused. One more thing. Find out if there's any family left for those 6 Summimpinus employers. Anyone who might want to know what really happened to their grandmother or aunt or mother. Anyone who might want to testify. Building a case took time. 2 weeks of quiet investigation. Phone calls to nursing homes in other states where Renata had worked under different names. Meetings with a forensic accountant who could trace the money trails. Conversations with a doctor who agreed to review the medical records and noticed disturbing patterns. Medications increased without justification. Symptoms that should have triggered hospital visits, but never did. Decline that was too rapid to be natural. And through it all, Dashiell kept watch on the house on Whitmore Street. Not personally, he had people for that, but the reports came daily. Cordelia hadn't left the house since the day at the diner. The bedroom light went on at 7 a.m. and off at 8 p.m. Renata left every Thursday afternoon for 2 hours, shopping based on the bags she returned with, and that was the only time Cordelia was left alone. The phone number Dashiell had given her remained unused. No calls, no messages. Either Cordelia hadn't found the courage to use it, or she'd lost the card, or, and this was the possibility that kept Dashiell awake at night, Renata had found it, and the consequences had been worse than silence. On the 15th day, Cordelia called. It was 3:47 in the morning. Dante's phone, the one connected to the number on the card, buzzed once and then fell silent. He called back immediately. No answer. He called again. This time someone picked up. Hello? Cordelia's voice was barely audible, a thread of sound in the darkness. Is Is this the number from the diner? It is. Mrs. Ashworth, are you safe? A long pause. He could hear her breathing, shallow, rapid, afraid. She's sleeping, Cordelia whispered. I found the key. To the bedroom. She keeps it in her drawer. I've been waiting for her to take one of her pills. She takes something to help her sleep. And tonight, she finally did. Can you get out of the house? I don't know. I don't know where I would go. My son is in Seattle. I don't have any money. She took it all, and if I try to leave and she wakes up, her voice cracked. You don't understand. No one will believe me. I'm just a confused old woman. That's what she's told everyone. That's what they'll all think. Mrs. Ashworth. Dashiell kept his voice calm, steady, an anchor in her storm. I believe you, and I'm not the only one. There are others who know the truth about Renata Voss, about what she's done to you and to the people who came before you. We have evidence, documentation, witnesses. Silence on the other end. Then, very quietly, people who came before me. 6 of them, that we know of, all elderly, all in the same situation you're in now, all dead. He heard her sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone finally understanding the full scope of the danger they were in. What do you need me to do? She asked. I need you to hold on for 3 more days. Can you do that? 3 more days, and then it will be over, I promise. 3 days. She repeated it like a prayer. Yes, I can do that. I've survived 19 months. I can survive 3 more days. Good. Now listen carefully. This is what's going to happen. He talked for 15 minutes. Instructions, precautions, what to expect and when. When he finished, Cordelia was crying. He could hear it in her breathing, but when she spoke, her voice was stronger than he'd ever heard it. Thank you, she said. Whoever you really are. Thank you. Thank my mother, Dashiell replied. She's the one who taught me that some debts have to be paid. The knock on the door came at 9 a.m. on a Thursday. Renata Voss was in the kitchen, preparing Cordelia's morning medication, the pills that weren't what they were supposed to be, the ones that kept her patient foggy and compliant. She set down the pill bottle and went to answer the door, smoothing her hair and arranging her expression into one of pleasant helpfulness. 2 people stood on the porch. A woman in a gray blazer, holding a clipboard, a man in a police uniform. Ms. Voss? The woman asked. I'm Harriet Chen from Adult Protective Services. This is Officer Delacroix. We're here to conduct a welfare check on Cordelia. Ashworth. Renata's smile didn't waver. Of course. Come in. Mrs. Ashworth is just having her breakfast. I'm sure she'll be delighted to see you. She doesn't get many visitors these days. Her memory isn't what it used to be, I'm afraid, so she sometimes gets confused. But I'll do my best to help. They followed her inside. Officer Delacroix's eyes moved methodically around the room, noting details. Harriet Chen consulted her clipboard. We've received some concerns, she said, about Mrs. Ashworth's care. We'd like to speak with her alone, if you don't mind. The first crack appeared in Renata's composure, just a flicker, just a momentary tightening around the eyes. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Mrs. Ashworth gets very anxious without me present, and as I said, she's quite confused. She might say things that aren't accurate. I wouldn't want her to upset herself. We'd still like to speak with her alone, Harriet Chen repeated. Her voice was pleasant, but carried an undertone of steel. It's standard procedure. Officer Delacroix positioned himself near the doorway, not blocking it, exactly, just present. Renata had no choice. She led them to Cordelia's bedroom, unlocked the door. The lock on the outside didn't escape Harriet Chen's notice, and stood aside. Cordelia was sitting in a chair by the window, dressed in clean clothes, and looking more alert than she had in months. She had stopped taking the pills 3 days ago, flushing them down the toilet while Renata wasn't watching. The fog was lifting. Her mind was her own again. Mrs. Ashworth? Harriet Chen approached slowly, her voice gentle. My name is Harriet. I'm from Adult Protective Services. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes. Just you and me, is that okay? Cordelia looked past her to where Renata stood in the doorway, face frozen in that helpful smile. Then she looked back at Harriet Chen. Yes, she said. Her voice was clear, strong. I have a great deal I'd like to tell you. The door closed. Renata was escorted to the living room by Officer Delacroix, who had questions of his own. And in the bedroom, Cordelia Ashworth began to speak. She told them everything: the isolation, the control over her phone calls and her money, the medications that weren't what they were supposed to be, the door that locked from the outside, the threats disguised as concern, the bruises that Renata always had an explanation for, the slowly dawning horror of realizing she had become a prisoner in her own home. She told them about the changes to her will that she hadn't agreed to, about the bank withdrawals she hadn't authorized, about the insurance policy that Renata had assured her was just a formality. And she told them about the pills in the kitchen, the ones that had kept her confused for months, the ones that were making her doubt her own mind. Harriet Chen took notes. She took photographs of the lock on the bedroom door. She collected the pill bottles and the financial documents, and the phone records that Renata had thought were hidden. When she emerged from the bedroom an hour later, her expression was grim. "Miss Voss," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Renata's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. She's confused. I've dedicated my life to taking care of that woman. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's making things up because she's angry that I have to set boundaries for her own safety. If you check my references—" "We've already checked your references," Harriet Chen said quietly. "All of them, including the ones you thought no one would find." Renata's face went pale. "Margaret Holloway died 14 months after hiring you. Estate valued at $340,000, most of which disappeared in the months before her death. Harold Whitfield died 11 months after hiring you. Life insurance policy changed 3 weeks before he passed. Eloise Cunningham, Beatrice Moreno, Franklin Okonkwo, Sylvia Chen." Harriet Chen's voice was steady, but there was cold fury beneath it. 6 people, 6 deaths, 6 fortunes that somehow ended up in accounts connected to you. Officer Delacroix stepped forward. "Renata Voss, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and suspicion of medical neglect. You have the right to remain silent." The words faded into background noise. Renata was handcuffed, low outside, placed in the back of a squad car that had appeared sometime in the last hour. And in the bedroom, Cordelia Ashworth stood at the window and watched her jailer being driven away. Her hands weren't shaking. The investigation took months. More victims were identified. 3 others who had survived Renata's care and been too afraid or too confused to speak up. More evidence emerged. More witnesses came forward. In the end, Renata Voss was charged with 6 counts of elder abuse, 6 counts of financial exploitation, and 3 counts of medical neglect. The murder charges were harder to prove. She had been careful, always careful. But the prosecutor was confident that the pattern of evidence would be enough. The trial made national news, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of the elderly, the failures of oversight systems, the monsters who preyed on people when they were most alone. Cordelia testified. She sat in the witness box, a small woman in a blue dress, a new one, bought with her own money from an account that was hers again, and told her story in a voice that didn't waver. When she finished, the jury was silent. Several of them were crying. The verdict came 3 days later, guilty on all counts. Renata Voss was sentenced to 32 years in prison. She would be 86 by the time she was eligible for parole, if she lived that long. Justice, in the end, was quiet. No spectacle, no revenge fantasy, just truth, spoken aloud in a room full of people who finally believed it. 6 months later, Cordelia sat in Marigold's diner at the same table where Rutsa. Everything had changed. The coffee was the same. The checkered tablecloths were the same. The smell of fresh bread from the back kitchen was the same. But everything else was different. She came here every Tuesday now. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Mabel, dear Mabel, who had cried when she learned what had happened, and apologized 100 times for believing that Cordelia simply didn't want to see her anymore. Sometimes with Eunice from next door, who brought homemade cookies and gossip about the neighborhood, and never once made Cordelia feel like a burden. Bennett had visited, finally. He had flown in from Seattle and sat in her living room looking shell-shocked and guilty and heartbroken all at once. I should have known, he kept saying. I should have checked. I should have come to see you more often. I should have. Cordelia had let him apologize. Then she had taken his hand and told him the truth, that there was no way he could have known, that Renata had been very, very good at hiding what she was. That blame was a heavy thing to carry, and she didn't want him carrying it for the rest of his life. They talked for hours that day, really talked, about Theodore, about the loneliness that had swallowed her after his death, about the guilt Bennett felt for not being there, about the future, which suddenly seemed longer and brighter than it had in years. Bennett called every week now, sometimes twice, and he was planning to visit again next month with his wife and children, who had never met their grandmother because Seattle was so far and life was so busy, and there was always another excuse. No more excuses, not anymore. The door to the diner opened. Cordelia looked up. Dashiell Whitmore Crane stood in the entrance, just as he had that first day. Dark suit, quiet eyes, the same contained stillness that suggested depths most people would never see. He walked over to her table. "May I? Please." She gestured to the seat across from her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The waitress came by, took Dante's order, black coffee, no sugar, and left them alone. "I never properly thanked you," Cordelia said finally. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to, but I want to." She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. Her fingers were still thin, still fragile looking, but they were steady now. Rock steady. "What you did, the investigation, the evidence, making sure the right people saw the truth. You saved my life, and not just mine, all those other families who finally got answers about what happened to their loved ones." Dashiell looked at their joined hands. Something shifted behind his eyes, a softening, maybe, a crack in the careful composure. "I told you," he said quietly. "It was a debt. Your mother. My mother, who you helped when no one else would, who lived because of that help, who raised a son who grew up to be whatever I am." He paused. "She would have been proud of this, not of the other things I do, but of this. She would have said this was the right use of power." Cordelia smiled. It was a real smile, warm, unreserved, the kind she used to give before grief and fear had taught her to hide. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was, in the ways that mattered. They drank their coffee in companionable silence. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk. People walked by, living their ordinary lives, unaware that inside this small diner, two people from vastly different worlds were sharing a moment of quiet connection. "What will you do now?" Dashiell asked. Cordelia considered the question. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined having a future to plan. Now it stretched before her, full of possibility. "I've been thinking about volunteering," she said. "At the library. They have a program for seniors to help children with reading. It wouldn't be the same as working there, but..." She trailed off, then smiled. "It would be nice to be useful again, to help someone. The way your mother came to me, the way you came to me, I'd like to be able to do that for someone else." Dashiell nodded slowly. "That sounds right." He finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the edge of the table, he paused. "If you ever need anything, Mrs. Ashworth, anything at all." "I know." She held up the card, the same white card with the phone number, now worn soft at the edges from being held so many times. "I still have this." He almost smiled. "Keep it somewhere safe." "I will." He walked out of the diner without looking back, just like before. Cordelia watched him go. Then she turned back to the window, to the sunlight, to the ordinary beautiful world outside.